Marcus, are you certain about these two? No one else has chosen them. Marcus Bell stood in the hallway of Restoration House Children's Home with a folder in his hands that a stranger had just pressed on him like a warning. 41 hours earlier, he had signed away his marriage in a lawyer's office on the other side of town, and he still had $310 to his name, and a work badge clipped to a shirt that smelled like the loading dock he'd worked for the last 11 years. Behind the woman holding that folder, in the far corner of a room full of children, two 7-year-old twins sat with their backs to the wall, reading, not speaking, not looking up when the door opened. Every other child in that room had turned toward the sound of a new adult walking in. These two hadn't moved. I've shown you 3 easier placements already, Mr. Bell. Why these two? Marcus asked why none of the other families had looked twice. The woman, a caseworker named Diane Prout who had run that intake office for 11 years, told him plainly that 3 households had tried in the last year and a half, and all 3 had returned the twins within 10 weeks. She told him the twins didn't cry. They didn't ask to be held. They answered questions and closed the conversation, and every family that took them home eventually admitted the same thing out loud. They didn't feel loved back. Marcus asked her one more time, quieter. Why these two, out of every child in this building? And he answered his own question before she could. Because nobody chose me either. That's all he knew standing in that hallway. From that afternoon forward, he was going to love those 2 children with everything a man who had just lost everything else still had left to give. He had no way of knowing yet that, in 20 years, strangers 3 states away would recognize his children's names on sight. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Marcus sat across a laminate table from a lawyer neither he nor his wife could really afford, watching Renee sign the last of the papers without once meeting his eyes. She had a new job offer in Charlotte and a new man who came with it, and the lawyer kept using the word amicable the way a person uses a bandage on a wound that's already stopped needing one. 11 years of marriage ended in the time it took to notarize 4 pages. Renee told him on the way out that she wasn't sorry, only tired of waiting for a life that kept getting postponed. Marcus didn't argue. He'd been the one postponing it, working doubles at the freight terminal so there'd be enough left over after rent, telling himself next year, until there were no more next years left to offer her. He drove home to an apartment that already looked half abandoned. Renee had taken the good couch, the television, the wedding china neither of them ever used. What remained fit into a bedroom, a kitchen table, and one closed door at the end of the hall that Marcus had not opened in 6 years. He and Renee had painted that room pale green once back when the doctors still used words like promising. 2 rounds of treatment later, a specialist in Atlanta told them plainly that biology had made its decision, and there was nothing left to negotiate. Renee wanted to clear the room out immediately. Marcus asked for time. He kept asking for time for 6 years, until the room became a kind of shrine neither of them visited, and eventually became one more reason she stopped waiting on him for anything at all. That night he didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold and let his mind travel back further than the marriage, back to when he was 6 years old in a small town outside Birmingham, the third of 4 kids in a house that could barely feed 2. His father worked construction when there was construction to be had. His mother cleaned houses on the west side of town. When Marcus was 6, an aunt in Detroit offered to take one of the children off their hands for a while, just until things got easier. His parents chose his younger brother, the one who laughed easy and never gave anyone trouble. Marcus stayed behind, and by the time he was old enough to understand why, the reason had stopped hurting in a sharp way and settled instead into something duller and more permanent. He wasn't the child anyone fought to keep close. He was the one who got left in the house that was already too full. He didn't finish that coffee. He went to work the next morning because the freight terminal didn't know or care that his marriage had ended, and there were pallets that needed moving regardless of what a man was carrying inside himself. He'd worked there 11 years, long enough to know every driver by name and every supervisor's blind spot, long enough that his hands had gone permanently rough in a way that no longer bothered him. That afternoon, on his lunch break, he sat in his truck in the parking lot and did something he hadn't planned on doing. He opened his phone and typed Adoption Alabama single father requirements. He read for 40 minutes straight, past the point where his break had technically ended, past the point where his supervisor texted asking where he was. The state's page kept using certain phrases: waiting children, sibling sets, kids with a documented trauma history, children who age out of the system before anyone chooses them at all. Marcus sat with that last phrase longer than the others. He had $310 in checking, a truck with 140,000 miles on it, and a two-bedroom apartment with a room at the end of the hall that had been closed for 6 years. He filled out the preliminary interest form right there in the parking lot. Under the field asking why he wanted to adopt, he typed one sentence and didn't second-guess it. Because I know what it's like to be the one nobody chose to keep, and I don't want another child carrying that if I can help it. 4 miles across town, in a converted brick elementary school that now housed Restoration House Children's Home, 7-year-old twins lay awake in their beds long after lights out. The boy's name was Isaiah. His sister's name was Camille. Isaiah whispered across the gap between their beds that the Hendersons hadn't picked them either, that made it 3 families in 18 months, and maybe they should stop keeping count. Camille didn't answer for a long moment. Then she said quietly that hopping wasn't a useful thing to keep doing if it never once paid off. Isaiah didn't argue with her, because he'd been thinking the same thing for longer than he wanted to admit. But in the dark, his hand found hers across the space between their beds, and neither of them let go until they fell asleep. Saturday morning came in with the kind of soft gold light that makes a person believe, for a few minutes, that the day ahead might be gentle. Marcus drove his truck to the edge of town, where Restoration House sat behind a chain-link fence and a small gravel lot. The paperwork on his passenger seat had been signed and re-signed for 2 weeks straight. His supervisor at the terminal, a woman named Patris who'd known him for 9 years, had written him a reference letter without being asked twice. The home study interview was scheduled for the following month. Today, he told himself, was only a visit. He'd learned a long time ago that nothing in his life that mattered had ever stayed just a visit. Diane Prout met him at the front office, a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, and a manner that had gone tired but not unkind after 2 decades in that building. She sat him down before showing him anything and told him she needed to be honest. Restoration House currently had 19 children available for placement. Given his application, first-time father, no prior experience with higher needs children, she wanted to introduce him first to 2 specific kids: a 5-year-old girl named Destiny and an 8-year-old boy named Marcus's namesake, a child named Marquis who grinned before anyone even finished a sentence near him. Both sweet, both easy, both children who could make a broken man feel whole again inside of a single afternoon. Marcus asked if he could see the whole room first, just walk through before deciding anything. Diane hesitated, glanced at her folder, then agreed. She led him down a hallway lined with construction paper artwork into the main activity room, where 14 children sat scattered across tables and rugs. 12 of them looked up the second the door opened. Destiny waved before Marcus had even stepped fully inside. Marquis held up a half-built tower of blocks like an offering. These were easy choices. The kind of children who could heal a person without either party having to work very hard at it. But Marcus's attention had already drifted toward a corner table by the window, where 2 children sat with their backs half-turned to the room. The boy had a library book about the solar system open in front of him. The girl was reading a paperback novel 2 grade levels above what anyone would expect from a 7-year-old. They had the same sharp jawline, the same steady dark eyes, the same habit of not looking up when a door opened. Marcus watched the boy slide a folded scrap of paper across the table. The girl read it without expression, nodded once, and slid it back. Not a single word passed between them the entire time Marcus stood there. He turned to Diane and asked, quietly, who those two were. Her tired smile tightened at the corners before she answered. Isaiah and Camille, 7 years old twins, she said. Their mother had them at 19 and passed less than 2 years later from complications the hospital caught too late to treat. Their maternal grandparents declined custody outright, citing their own health and finances. The biological father had been located and contacted on 3 separate occasions and had not responded a single time. Marcus asked why, out of 19 children in that building, these two hadn't been placed yet. Diane's tired smile finally cracked all the way through. 3 families had tried in the last 18 months, she told him. All 3 had returned the children, on average, within 10 weeks. Isaiah and Camille didn't cry. They didn't smile easily. They didn't say the words back that most parents needed to hear in order to feel like the arrangement was working. The twins' testing put both of them well above average intelligence, gifted by any clinical measure, but emotionally, Diane searched for the right word and landed on guarded. Their assigned therapist had left after 4 months, telling the staff he'd never once had a client analyze his own grief interventions out loud instead of engaging with them. Marcus watched Isaiah turn a page. 2 seconds later, without any visible signal passing between them, Camille turned to page 2. Diane told him, more gently now, that most adoptive parents needed to feel loved back in order to keep showing up, and these 2 children simply didn't have much of that to offer in return. Not yet, maybe not for years. And she told him plainly that in 54 days, both children would age out of Restoration House's junior wing and transfer to a state facility that, by regulation, did not house siblings together past age 8. Marcus asked if that meant they'd be separated. Diane confirmed it. On their 8th birthday, unless a placement was finalized before then, Isaiah and Camille would go to different homes in different counties and likely never share a room again. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, turning that fact over the way he turned over a bad diagnosis or a bounced check, looking for an angle that made it hurt less and not finding one. Then he said the same sentence he'd typed into a form at a laminate kitchen table 3 weeks earlier. He wanted to meet them. Diane walked him across the room slowly, the way a person approaches something wild that might startle and run. She introduced him by name. Isaiah looked up first, calm, assessing, the way a person looks at a math problem they haven't decided is worth solving yet. Camille looked up a half-second later, more cautious. Marcus didn't loom over them the way adults sometimes do without noticing. He lowered himself to the floor, crossed his legs, and let his eyes land level with theirs before he said anything at all. Isaiah asked him flatly what he was doing down there. Marcus told him he wanted to find out what they liked. Camille asked why that mattered to anyone. Marcus told her the truth instead of something easier. He said that when he was 6 years old, his own parents sent his younger brother away to live with an aunt because that brother was easier to manage, and kept Marcus behind in a house that never once felt like it wanted him in it. Isaiah looked at him directly for the first time and asked how old he'd been. Marcus told him 6. Camille said quietly that they'd been 7 when their mother died, and nobody had come for them either, and she already knew that feeling before he'd finished the sentence. There was a silence after that, the kind that most adults rush to fill and Marcus let sit instead. Then Isaiah asked him if he was only here because he felt sorry for them. Marcus told him no, he was here because he didn't want to keep walking past 2 kids in a corner, and that those were 2 very different reasons. The twins exchanged a look between themselves that lasted almost 2 full seconds. To anyone else in that room, it would have registered as nothing. To Diane, who had watched these 2 children for 18 months straight, it registered as something she had genuinely never seen them do in front of an adult before. Marcus stood, brushed the carpet dust from his jeans, and told Diane plainly that he wanted to apply for both of them. Back in her office, Diane's kindness gave way to something more guarded, the look of a person who had watched this exact movie play out 3 times already and knew precisely how it ended. She told Marcus to listen carefully. He was newly divorced. He worked 10-hour shifts with rotating overtime. These 2 children needed specialized educational support, ongoing behavioral therapy, and a kind of patience that had already broken 3 full households in under a year and a half combined. She had a stack of applications from 2-income couples who had also been declined for these exact 2 children. She could place him with Destiny or Marquis that same afternoon. Marcus listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked her one question. Of the 3 families that had given up, had any of them offered a reason that wasn't ultimately about themselves? Diane opened her mouth, closed it, and admitted that no, none of them had. Marcus told her then that those hadn't been families looking for children. Those had been people looking for an experience, and he wasn't interested in an experience. He was looking for his kids. Diane studied him for a long moment before she opened a drawer and slid a much thicker folder across the desk. 54 days, she told him. A home study, a financial review, a background check, 2 rounds of psychological evaluation for him as the prospective parent, and a supervised transition period before anything became final. Miss one requirement, even one, and the twins went to the state facility as scheduled. Marcus pulled the folder toward himself and asked where he needed to sign first. The 54 days that followed were the hardest stretch of his adult life. He sold his late grandfather's pocket watch to a pawn shop off Highway 31 for $290 and used the money for 2 twin beds, second-hand nightstands, and a stack of used books from a church sale. He repainted the green room a plain, clean white, working nights after his shifts ended. A social worker flagged his 1-bedroom adjacent layout as inadequate for 3 people, so he borrowed $400 from Patris at the terminal, telling her only that he needed it for a deposit, not what the deposit was actually for. He picked up every overtime shift the terminal would give him and took a weekend job unloading trucks at a warehouse across town. He was sleeping 4 hours a night by the 3rd week and had lost 11 pounds by the 6th. The first home visit did not go well. A caseworker named Rhonda Ellis walked through his apartment with a clipboard and a line of questioning that felt, to Marcus, less like an evaluation and more like an accusation dressed up in professional language. She asked how he intended to fund specialized therapy on a single warehouse worker's income. He told her the terminal's employee assistance program covered a sliding scale for dependent counseling, and that Patris had already agreed to adjust his schedule around the twins' school hours. Rhonda asked what would happen if one of the children had a medical emergency during one of his overnight shifts. Marcus told her he'd worked in warehouse safety long enough to be first aid certified twice over, and that he'd figure out the rest the way he'd figured out everything else in his life. She wrote something down and said nothing further. 2 weeks later, the county denied his application, citing insufficient financial stability for 2 children with documented special needs. Marcus didn't sleep at all that night. The following morning, he filed an appeal in person, sitting through his entire lunch break in a county office waiting room to make sure it got filed correctly. Patris wrote him a letter. His pastor wrote him a letter. A former coworker whose own son Marcus had mentored through a rough patch years earlier wrote a letter neither of them had asked her to write. The second review came back 3 weeks later, conditionally approved. Day 53. Day 54. On the final day, Marcus drove back to Restoration House with 2 second-hand backpacks on the passenger seat where the paperwork used to sit. Diane met him at the door and shook his hand without a word of further warning. The twins were waiting in the activity room, each holding exactly 1 item from their old life, identical black composition notebooks they'd apparently been keeping since they were old enough to write in full sentences. Diane knelt down and told them it was time. They stood without a word and walked toward the door on their own. In the truck, Marcus talked the entire drive home, filling the silence with details about the newly painted room, the books on the shelf, the dinner he'd planned for that first night. A small potted plant on the windowsill he'd already named Gerald for no particular reason. The twins said nothing back. They sat in the back seat holding their notebooks against their chests. When they arrived, Marcus opened the bedroom door and let them see it for the first time. Isaiah walked in first, stopped at the bed nearest the window, and touched the blanket carefully, almost testing whether it was real. Then he turned around and asked Marcus directly if he was going to send them back like the others had. Marcus knelt down in front of him at eye level, the same way he had at the children's home weeks earlier. He told Isaiah his name was Marcus, and that Isaiah and Camille could call him that or call him Dad, whichever felt right, and that there was no deadline on making that decision. But no, he told them, nobody was sending them anywhere. Not now, not ever, not while he had breath left in him. Isaiah didn't cry and didn't smile, but he kept his hand on that blanket for a full 10 minutes without moving it. Camille walked over silently and stood beside her brother, reaching out to hold the other corner of the same blanket, as though the two of them were both checking, independently, whether something soft was finally going to be allowed to stay. The first weeks were quiet in a way Marcus hadn't fully prepared himself for. Isaiah and Camille moved through the apartment like polite, careful tenants rather than children. They ate breakfast without being asked twice, washed their own dishes, folded their own laundry, and retreated back to their books the moment a task was finished. They called him Sir for the first several weeks, and Marcus never corrected them, choosing instead to simply keep showing up the same way every single day. He made breakfast every morning without fail, pancakes on Saturdays, oatmeal on weekdays. He read to them at night even when neither twin reacted visibly to a single word of it. He left their bedroom door cracked so they could see his shadow pass in the hallway before he went asleep himself. He didn't push. He didn't perform warmth he didn't feel. He simply stayed, day after day, the way he'd learned a long time ago that staying was the only proof that actually meant anything to a child who'd been left before. The black notebooks went everywhere with them. Camille carried hers in her backpack to school. Isaiah kept his under his pillow. Both of them wrote in them every night before bed, shoulders hunched over the page, and Marcus noticed without ever once asking what was inside. One Saturday, Camille left hers on the kitchen table by accident. Marcus picked it up, held it for a long moment, and set it back down without opening a single page. When Patris asked him about it later over coffee at the terminal, he told her it was the only thing those two children owned that had survived everything else in their lives, and he wasn't going to be the next person who took something from them without asking. On Sundays, Marcus took the twins to a small park near the reservoir. A wooden bench under an oak tree became, without either of them planning it, their regular spot. Marcus invented a game where they'd watch strangers pass and try to name what each person was feeling and why. That man's shoulders are loose, he'd say. That means he's probably not carrying much worry today. That woman's moving slow but her face isn't sad, so maybe she's just tired, not upset. For the first month, the twins only watched and wrote notes in their notebooks without speaking. On the fifth Sunday, Camille finally pointed at an older woman crossing the grass with a small grocery bag and offered her own read. Tired, she said, but not sad. Marcus asked her why she thought that. She said maybe the woman was walking home to somebody she loved. It was the first time either twin had offered an answer instead of simply absorbing one, and Marcus drove home that evening feeling something in his chest loosen for the first time in months. The first time either twin called him Dad came 8 weeks into the placement. Isaiah spiked a high fever in the middle of the night, and Camille knocked on Marcus's door at 3 in the morning, her voice still flat but cracking faintly at the edges. Dad, she said, Isaiah isn't okay. Marcus didn't stop to register the word before he moved. He wrapped Isaiah in a blanket, carried him to the truck, and drove to the emergency room through empty streets. A doctor told him afterward it was viral, nothing more serious, and that he'd done the right thing bringing him in immediately. In the waiting room, Camille sat beside him and after a long silence, placed her small hand on top of his without squeezing it, without saying a word, and left it there for nearly an hour. Marcus understood, sitting in that plastic chair at 4 in the morning, that this was the moment the two of them had finally chosen him back. A week later, Marcus sat on the edge of the bed between his sleeping children, one hand resting on Isaiah's chest the way he did most nights, and whispered something he assumed neither of them could hear. He told them quietly that he didn't know if he was doing any of this the right way, only that he was never going to let anyone in this world hurt either one of them again if he could help it. But the twins weren't fully asleep. They lay still and silent, and across the gap between their beds, two small hands found each other in the dark and held on until morning. They had heard every word, and they would carry it with them for the next 2 decades. 3 months later, the twins turned 8. Marcus baked a lopsided chocolate cake with his own hands, put 8 candles on it, and lit each one with fingers that shook slightly, not from nerves but from how badly he wanted the small moment to land the way it deserved to. Isaiah blew out 4 candles. Camille blew out the other 4. Both of them said "Thank you, Dad," in voices that had started, finally, to sound almost ordinary. That night, walking past their room, Marcus caught sight of something he'd never seen before. Both twins sitting cross-legged on the floor, bent over the same notebook, voices low and urgent. Camille sketching something while Isaiah wrote figures beside it. When he appeared in the doorway, Isaiah closed the notebook gently but quickly. Marcus smiled, didn't ask, and walked on, though he paused just out of sight long enough to hear Isaiah murmur that it would take at least 15 years, maybe 20, and that they'd need to be patient. The years that followed moved the way years do when a father is working double shifts and his children are reading 3 grade levels ahead of their age. Camille skipped 5th grade, then 7th. Isaiah won a regional science competition at 10, a state-level competition at 11, and placed nationally at 12, with prize winnings that went straight into a savings account Marcus didn't even know existed until years later. Camille entered her first youth debate tournament at 11 and won the state championship the following year. By 13, she was the youngest competitor ever registered at her region's mock trial championship. Their trophies stayed modest. Their combined savings did not. But it was during this stretch, when the twins were 8 years and 4 months old, that the apartment complex where they lived became the site of something Marcus never saw coming. He'd rented a 3rd-floor unit in a modest 4-story building on the working-class side of town, a mixed building where black and white tenants had lived side by side for decades without much friction. When the twins moved in, quiet, reserved, carrying books too advanced for their age, the building's informal social current shifted in small, ugly ways Marcus initially chose to absorb rather than confront. A woman 2 floors down named Carol Whitfield, 66 years old and long retired, had opinions about nearly everything and shared them freely with the mail carrier, the building's handyman, and anyone else who'd stand still long enough to listen. She told more than one neighbor that the man in 3C had taken in 2 kids nobody else wanted, and that it was only a matter of time before it went badly, the way, in her words, these things always did. Marcus heard about it secondhand from a neighbor across the hall and chose, as he had his whole life, not to make it a fight worth having. He kept greeting Carol politely in the elevator. He kept the twins inside on Saturday mornings when he heard her voice carrying through the hallway. Some battles, he'd learned long before this one, you win simply by declining to enter them. But Isaiah and Camille were exceptionally observant children, and exceptionally observant children notice everything eventually, whether or not an adult intends for them to. It happened on a Saturday morning in early spring. Marcus had picked up a 6 a.m. shift, leaving the twins home with a neighbor's door propped open across the hall in case they needed anything. The children went downstairs to check the mailbox, and Carol's apartment door was cracked open, her voice carrying loud and unguarded the way people talk when they assume nobody nearby is actually listening. She was telling a friend on the phone that the man upstairs collecting somebody else's abandoned kids was setting a bad example for the whole building, that it ran in certain families, whatever that was supposed to mean, and that she'd told the landlord as much directly. Camille went very still. Isaiah felt something he had never consciously registered before in his 8 years of memory, something close to real anger. He pushed the door open. Carol spun around, phone still against her ear, face flushing red at being overheard. Isaiah told her flatly, in a voice far older than 8, that his father hadn't collected them. He had chosen them after 3 other families had already said no, and that was a fact, not an opinion up for debate. Camille stepped in beside her brother and calmly corrected the woman's assumptions about heredity and behavior, citing, with more precision than most adults could manage, the actual difference between correlation and causation. Carol's mouth fell open, then her face darkened further, and she demanded to know who had taught 2 children to speak to a grown woman that way. "Our father did," Camille told her, "and you don't get to talk about him like that." Carol rose from her chair, 66 years old, with an old, ingrained habit of handling disrespect from children with her hands rather than her words, and raised her arm just as the elevator down the hall opened. Marcus stepped out still in his work uniform, exhausted from a 6-hour shift, and took in the entire scene in under a second. His 2 children in a stranger's doorway and an older woman's hand raised in the air above them. He crossed the distance in 4 strides without a single thought, and placed his own body between Carol and his children, arms spread wide. Carol's raised hand was still frozen in the air, embarrassment curdling instantly into something uglier. She shouted for her husband, Gerald Whitfield, who also happened to hold the building's lease and served as the property's informal landlord alongside her. Gerald stepped out of the adjoining unit in a bathrobe, listened to 30 seconds of his wife's version of events, asked neither Marcus nor the twins a single question, and struck Marcus across the face hard enough to split his lip and send him staggering into the wall. The hallway rang with the sound of it. Isaiah and Camille froze completely, neither one moving, neither one breathing. Gerald told Marcus, in a voice practiced and cold, that he and his children had 30 days to vacate the building, and that he shouldn't bother calling the police, because Gerald would simply tell them Marcus had approached his wife first, and asked plainly who the responding officers would be more likely to believe: a divorced black man raising 2 adopted kids alone, or 2 longtime tenants who'd lived in that building for over 3 decades. Marcus stood there with his hand against his jaw, and then looked at his children and told them simply to come on upstairs. He didn't let himself break down in front of them, not in the elevator, not in the apartment. He ran the twins a bath, laid out their pajamas, and sent them off to wash up. Then he stood alone in the kitchen, pressed a dish towel to his split lip, and let his shoulders finally shake once the sound of running water gave him enough cover to do it without being seen. The twins didn't go to sleep that night. They sat together on the edge of Isaiah's bed in their pajamas and listened through the wall as their father moved around the kitchen far longer than usual, running the faucet longer than it needed to run, clearing his throat the way people do when they're trying to make their voice sound steady again. When Marcus finally came in to say good night, he was smiling, kissed each of them on the forehead, told them to sleep, that everything was fine. He turned off the light and left the door cracked the way he always did. Camille waited until she heard his bedroom door close, then slid out of bed, pulled the notebook from beneath her pillow, and sat cross-legged on the floor with her brother beside her. She handed him the pen. Isaiah wrote, in the careful print of a child determined to spell every word correctly, that their father had been struck today because of them, that he had hidden his pain because he thought they hadn't seen it, that they had seen every bit of it anyway, and that when they were older, no one would ever be allowed to speak about him or touch him that way again. They would build him a place where only good people were allowed through the door. Camille read it, nodded once, and signed her name beneath his. Marcus filed a police report the following morning. The responding officer was polite but clearly unmoved, typing up the account and asking if there had been any adult witnesses. There hadn't been. Gerald and Carol corroborated each other's version completely, and the report went nowhere. The officer told him, almost apologetically, that 30 days was the reality of his situation, and that staying past that point probably wasn't wise. Marcus thanked him and walked home without telling the twins any of it directly, though they'd already understood most of it on their own. He spent the following 2 weeks calling every rental listing within his budget and getting turned down 11 times, sometimes because a unit had suddenly just been rented, sometimes because a landlord simply stopped returning his calls the moment he gave his name. One property manager in the next county told him over the phone that the owner had decided to be more selective after some recent issues with previous tenants, and Marcus understood exactly what that meant without needing it spelled out further. He didn't argue. He picked up a second overtime shift at a distribution center across town, sleeping 4 hours a night, developing small bruises on his hands and forearms from moving too fast in the dark corners of a warehouse floor, simply the price of being too tired to see clearly where he was going. Every morning when he came home, the twins were already awake and waiting. Camille had learned to work the coffee maker on her own. Isaiah laid out the bread for breakfast without being asked. One morning Camille asked him plainly if they should stop going to school to help. Marcus told her no, her job was to learn, his job was to work, and that was simply the correct equation for now. Isaiah, quiet at the table, told him that equation was temporary and that they would write a new one eventually. Marcus, too exhausted to fully register what his 8-year-old son meant by that, only nodded and finished his coffee. On the 29th day, Patris introduced Marcus to a landlord she knew personally, a widower named Nikos Antonopoulos whose late wife had spent 30 years as a hospital nurse. Nikos asked very few questions, didn't require a doubled deposit, and let Marcus sign the lease that same afternoon. The new apartment was smaller, the hallway narrower, the neighbors considerably quieter. That first night, Marcus fell asleep on the couch mid-fold of a laundry basket, and the twins covered him with a blanket without waking him. Camille turned off the lamp. Isaiah opened the notebook and wrote one final line beneath the promise from a month earlier. Day 29. Dad won, but he paid too much for it. Next equation. How do we make sure he never has to pay that price again? The years moved forward the way years do. Marcus kept his double shifts longer than his body probably should have allowed. The bruises from the move eventually faded, though new small ones from years of overtime work never fully stopped appearing on his hands and forearms. By the time the twins turned 12, they were both 2 full grade levels ahead in school. By 13, 3 grade levels. The notebooks beneath Isaiah's bed had multiplied to 11 by then, each one labeled by year in his increasingly precise handwriting, each one filled with diagrams, rough business sketches, drafts of ideas neither twin ever offered to show their father, and each one carrying the same line scrawled somewhere near the bottom of nearly every page. Dad doesn't know yet. When the twins turned 16, 2 letters arrived in the same week's mail. A summer engineering research program at Georgia Tech accepted Isaiah on full scholarship. A pre-law summer institute at Emory accepted Camille on the same terms. Marcus read both letters twice at the kitchen table, his hands shaking hard enough that the paper rattled audibly. Isaiah did something he had never once done in the 9 years since his adoption. He walked around the table and hugged his father, arms landing stiff and uncertain across his shoulders because he genuinely didn't know where else to put them, but he held on for a full 12 seconds before letting go. Camille didn't hug. She simply placed one hand on her father's shoulder and left it there. 2 years after that, the official college acceptances arrived. Full academic scholarships, Georgia Tech for engineering for Isaiah, Emory Law's early admission track for Camille. That night at the kitchen table, Camille told her father quietly that he wouldn't have to work night shifts anymore. Marcus smiled the smile he'd been smiling for a decade and told her he worked nights because he liked the quiet. Isaiah looked at him directly and told him plainly that they'd both heard him talking to himself under his breath every single Sunday night since they were 7 years old, and that they knew he didn't like it at all, and that the equation was about to change very soon. Marcus laughed it off, patted his son's hand, and had no real idea his son had just made him a promise he fully intended to keep. The twins left for college that August. Their calls home came every Sunday at 7, 20 minutes at first, sometimes 30. Freshman year, the conversations were about classes and dorm roommates. Sophomore year, they were about specific professors and internships. By junior year, the calls had shortened to 10 minutes, occasionally less, filled with apologies for missing a holiday or cutting a visit short for a project deadline. Marcus never complained. He told himself this was simply what growing up looked like, that this was the entire point of everything he'd fought for. But some Sunday nights, after he'd hung up the phone, he sat alone on his small couch and felt something he hadn't let himself feel in over 20 years, the specific ache of being 6 years old again, watching someone he loved get smaller and smaller until they were simply gone. He never told either twin about that feeling. He made tea and went to bed instead. The twins graduated the same May, Camille from Emory Law, Isaiah from Georgia Tech's engineering program. Marcus flew to both ceremonies within the same week and cried harder at each one than either twin did, which made Camille laugh out loud for the first time in months, which nearly made Isaiah laugh too, which only made Marcus cry harder still. At dinner afterward in a small restaurant near campus, the twins told him they were moving back home to work on a project together. When he asked what kind of project, they only smiled and told him he'd see soon enough. He let it go, the way he'd learned to let a great many things go with these two over the years. They moved back to Alabama but didn't move back in with him, renting a small shared apartment of their own instead and visiting only 90 minutes each Sunday for dinner. Marcus offered them money more than once. They refused every time. He offered to visit their new place. They gently declined again and again, always with the same soft, genuine smile and the same 4 words, "Almost ready, Dad." Marcus began to quietly wonder, though he never said it aloud to anyone, whether he'd somehow lost them after everything. He kept making Sunday dinner anyway, because that, at least, was still something he could offer. On a Saturday morning in October, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Camille. "Dad, today, 11 a.m., wear the gray suit. A car will come get you. Don't ask questions, just trust us." Marcus put on the gray suit he'd only worn twice before, brushed what was left of his hair and looked in the mirror at a man of 62, more gray than not now, hands that had spent 4 decades doing hard, honest work. The car arrived precisely at 10:45 and drove him downtown, past the freight terminal where he'd worked for over 3 decades, past the small apartment building where a slap in a hallway had once cost him 30 days and nearly everything else. It stopped on a block in the middle of the city's newest commercial district, in front of 2 glass office towers standing side by side, both wrapped in dark fabric. A small crowd of maybe 50 people gathered on the sidewalk, a few local reporters, a handful of city officials, and at the very front, standing in matching dark suits, were Isaiah and Camille, waiting for him. Marcus stepped out of the car. Camille crossed to him first and took his right hand. Isaiah took his left. Camille leaned in close and asked if he remembered the bench by the reservoir. Marcus turned his head and saw, through a gap between the 2 towers, the small park still visible in the distance, the same wooden bench beneath the same oak tree, still standing after all these years. Isaiah told him quietly that they'd chosen this exact lot because the conference room windows on the top floor looked directly out at that bench, and that they'd made that decision when they were 7 years old. Marcus's knees nearly gave out beneath him, right there on the sidewalk. The twins handed him 2 thin cords, one each. Camille told him to pull his first. He did, and the dark fabric dropped away to reveal brushed steel letters 3 feet tall. Bell Engineering, founded by Isaiah Bell, in honor of Marcus Bell, the man who taught us what it meant to be chosen. Marcus made a small, involuntary sound and pressed his hand over his mouth. He pulled the second cord himself. The second building's fabric fell to reveal a matching set of letters. Bell Legal Group, founded by Camille Bell, dedicated to Marcus Bell, who chose us when nobody else would." The crowd applauded, though Marcus heard almost none of it. He turned to his children, tears running freely down his face now, though he wasn't sobbing, only finally releasing something the way an old wound does when someone finally presses on it gently enough. He asked them why they'd used his name instead of their own. Isaiah answered him, and for the first time in over 2 decades as his son, his voice cracked audibly on the words. "Because Bell isn't the name either of us was born carrying, Dad. It's the name you gave us. It's the only name either one of us ever wanted to keep for the rest of our lives." They walked their father inside Bell Engineering first. The lobby was glass and pale hardwood, one long wall covered floor to ceiling in black and white photographs, not of celebrities or investors, but of ordinary children, each one carrying the same distant, guarded look Isaiah and Camille had once carried into Restoration House 20 years earlier. Isaiah led him to a glass case in the center of the room. "Dad," he said, "this is our very first product. We call it Compass." The screen displayed a rotating series of human faces, each expression labeled clearly with the emotion behind it and a simple suggested response beneath. Marcus touched the glass gently. "This is what you used to do for us," Isaiah told him. "Every Sunday on that bench for 16 straight years. We ship it free to any public school that can't afford it. 14,000 units so far this year in over 400 schools." Camille walked him next into Bell Legal Group, past the intake desk and down a short hallway, stopping in front of a door marked Tenant Protection Division. Her voice went soft for the first time all morning. "Dad," she told him, "we represent tenants who get pushed out of their homes because of their race, their marital status, or the children they're raising. We don't charge a single one of them $1. We looked into what happened to Gerald and Carol Whitfield years ago. Gerald passed away 3 years back. We never once tried to sue either of them. We simply built the exact door they slammed shut on you and made sure other families never have to feel that same door close on them the way it closed on us." Marcus rested his hand against the door frame and didn't speak for a long moment. When he finally did, his voice came out barely above a whisper. "Camille," he said, "you were 8 years old." "I was 8, Dad," she answered him, "and I remember every single bit of it." They brought him up to the top floor, where 16 black composition notebooks sat stacked in careful chronological order on Isaiah's desk. Camille opened the very first one, the uneven print of a 7-year-old still visible on the page. "When we grow up, we will find a way so Dad never has to work another night shift again." The fifth notebook, written at age 12, held the earliest rough sketch of what would eventually become Compass. The 11th notebook read simply, "We are not leaving him behind. We are going to get the tools we need to come back for him properly." The 16th and final notebook, written only the month before, read, "Dad wears the gray suit. Don't tell him anything yet." Camille slid a folder across the desk toward her father. Inside sat paperwork granting him 30% ownership across both companies, a permanent seat as chairman of the Joint Advisory Board, the deed to a modest house in a quiet part of town already fully paid off in his name, and funding for a small community resource center on the city's east side, his to run personally or to simply leave untouched, whichever he preferred. Isaiah leaned forward and told him plainly that he didn't have to do a single thing with any of it if he didn't want to, but that everything in both buildings belonged to him regardless. Camille knelt down beside her father's chair, eye level with him, the exact same way he had once knelt in front of them both in a freshly painted white room 20 years earlier, and told him softly that he was finished with night shifts forever. 5 years later, Bell Engineering and Bell Legal Group operate together across 11 cities, and every single building carries the same small brass plaque near its entrance, in honor of Marcus Bell. On the 20th anniversary of the adoption, Marcus walks down to the bench by the reservoir the way he still does most Sunday mornings. A young father is there teaching his daughter to read strangers, expressions the same way Marcus once taught his own 2 children. A young man wearing a Tenant Protection Division lanyard bumps into him apologetically on the path and asks if he's all right, with no idea at all that the name printed on his own badge is the same name as the older man standing in front of him. Marcus smiles and tells him he's better than all right, and to go on ahead. So we'll ask you the same question we ask at the end of every one of these stories. Who chose you when nobody else did? Tell us their name in the comments below. We read every single one, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more stories like this.